Upwards of 80% of scoliosis cases are idiopathic in nature, meaning that there is no known cause, which is honestly quite depressing if you're someone who deals with a scoliotic curve and deals with pain or is inhibited in ranges of motion and movement as a result of it. I've personally never taken such statistics at face value, and after working with clients over the years and improving not only alignment in the spine, but also quality of life, I've found some ways to approach scoliosis that isn't your typical cookie cutter approach, strengthen this and stretch that. It's far deeper than that. So whether you're someone who deals with scoliosis personally, or you work in a more professional setting, this video will have something for you. By the end of this video, you will gain an understanding as to the potential reasons as to why a scoliosis may be present, as well as learn a step-by-step model as to how to address it. Let's get into it. When we're looking at scoliosis, there's three primary types. Idiopathic, which we mean has an unknown origin, congenital, meaning that you're born with it, and neuromuscular, which is caused by a neurological or muscular condition. Now in this video, we aren't gonna focus so much on the last two, but we're gonna really narrow in on the first one, idiopathic. It's not to say that the concepts in this video won't help you if you deal with the congenital or neuromuscular version, but in my experience, it presents different challenges. So taking into account that you weren't born with it or that you don't have a neuromuscular condition, you're left with this unknown origin. Now, my hypothesis is that of the 80% of idiopathic cases, likely more than 50% of them are functional in nature, meaning developed throughout the course of your life. Now, there's too many reasons to account for as to the exact reason as to why, but more often than not, it leaves your body in a state of misalignment, with the hips and ribcage being directionally drawn away from one another, and the same thing happening at the shoulders and the head. Now, the wild part is that if the body is presenting itself in this way, it doesn't necessarily mean that your body is broken. In fact, one of, if not the fastest man on the planet, has this exact condition, Usain Bolt. That being said, it can become a problem. And more often than not, the people that I'm working with often present with hip tightness, lower back pain, and shoulder and neck tension. Now, perfect body symmetry is impossible, but we can certainly start to take ourselves to a lesser degree of asymmetry and bring ourselves just a little bit closer to neutral. And in my experience, having worked with people, it often leads to a reduction in symptoms, an improvement in movement economy, and in general, enhances quality of life. Let's get into some of the exercises that will help you do the same. So to make this video easy to follow along with, we are going to assume that my scoliosis pattern is a pelvic shift to the left with a ribcage shift to the right. Now, yours might be different than that, in which case you're essentially just going to inverse all the exercises that we're doing today. But if that is your patterning, then you're gonna be able to simply just follow along. So for this first one, you're gonna wanna grab a yoga block. And because we are dealing with a asymmetry, the way in which we're gonna approach exercises is going to be asymmetrical. So to start with this first one, you're gonna grab your yoga block and you're gonna come to a seated position. You don't even have to leave your chair, which is great. And what we're gonna start with is getting more weight distributed onto our left hip bone. Because the hips tend to be more shifted to the left, which causes this shifting of the rib cage to the right, we're gonna work on drawing that left hip back into a slight internal rotation by creating a subtle asymmetry of weight of which hip bone we are gonna be sitting on. Now, how we're gonna approach that is you're gonna take your right leg just a little bit further in front of your left, and then you're just gonna push your right knee forward. And as that happens, you'll probably feel a little bit more weight come to your left butt cheek and just a little bit more pressure come in through there. And that is just gonna allow us to bring the pelvis into a slightly more neutral position. So now that we have the hips set, we're gonna start to come upstream. So you're gonna grab your block. What we're gonna do with the block is you're gonna take it in front of you, and we're gonna start to introduce some pressure into the side that we have more compression against. So to start with here, we are gonna start to introduce some pressure into that left side because that is where we have more of a compression tendency. And at the same time that we're starting to cycle in the inhale, we're also gonna think about scooping that left elbow forward. And you can see that as that is happening, we're creating spacing between where the pelvis and really the armpit is. And you can imagine there being almost like a subtle line between those 2 points. What we're gonna attempt to do here is fill that in with as much pressure as we can. Now, with each consecutive inhale that we take, we're just gonna continue to try to top up pressure into that area, trying not to allow ourselves to recollapse, and just try to notice if any of the muscles are trying to grab, maybe pull you back into that in any way. And really, you're just trying to breathe in an expansive way, not in a very stressful way, but just in a way where we can start to increase expansion and space into that area. For this next exercise, we're gonna build on the principles from the previous exercise with that asymmetry that we're creating between the hips and the upper body. But now we're gonna do so up against the wall in a standing position. So for this one, you're gonna come up to the wall. We're gonna create that same asymmetrical base that we're just creating in a seated position, but now we're gonna do so standing. So in this case, we're gonna be taking our right foot slightly in front of our left, and we're gonna start to draw some awareness to our left heel. We're just gonna try to bias some weight into that area as an attempt to bring the pelvis into a more neutral position. Now, once we have the base through the feet and through the pelvis, you're gonna grab your yoga block and you're gonna come up against the wall, and we're gonna work a single arm elbow scoop into the yoga block. So what we're gonna start to bring some awareness to is this idea of our left heel having quite a bit of pressure through the lower body and our left elbow having quite a bit of pressure into the yoga block. And this is gonna start to create a opposing tension away from one another. So really we're stretching kind of the two furthest points of where your scoliotic pattern might be kind of pulling you into. And we're gonna try to create spacing between those 2 points. Now, what's different about this in comparison, say, to a passive stretch is we're giving the body a understanding of how we want to redistribute weight, in this case through our feet, through our hips, how to organize pressure in our upper body around it, rather than just kind of passively hanging out and creating length through the tissue. That's not really gonna allow or give our body any type of feedback or framework as to how we need to organize tension and pressure in our body in order to support our structure in a more neutral way. Something to be mindful of as you're going through this exercise in particular is your tendency of the hips to maybe overshift directionally back into your pattern, or the rib cage here especially. Because we are starting to incorporate some thoracic rotation into this, you are gonna have to be mindful that you're not compressing into the side that you deal with your scoliosis on. And I would recommend spending anywhere between 30 to about 45 seconds here, just taking that pressure in, letting it fall out. Again, not allowing yourself to go back into that compressive tendency. Give yourself a little break, and then you can cycle through that anywhere between 3 to 5 times. Now, one thing that I think is really important, almost regardless of condition, is trying to get some type of movement or dynamic practice in. So taking all the sensations and everything that we're working on in our corrective work, we're gonna start to build that in a more dynamic movement. Now, we'll definitely wanna be mindful that we're not feeding the potential pattern that we're already in as we're going through this. So how we're gonna make sure that we're not doing that is we're gonna first establish a wide base. And by getting our base a little bit wider, it's gonna take us out of this potential tendency for us to overly shift the hips or weight into one side. And to start with, I want you to think you're almost starting in a horse stance with 50-50 weight on each side. From here, what we are gonna begin to do is just start with a weight transfer and a slight hip rotation from one side to the other. So we're not even focused so much on the upper body for now. I just want you to think you're bringing weight from one foot to the other. You're letting the hips just kind of naturally rotate as you're going through that. And as this becomes more familiar and you have the coordination a little bit more dialed in, what we're gonna start to incorporate is a hook up top. So now as we're transferring weight from one foot to the other, we're also gonna be working on this hook, and we're doing a very subtle rotation and lean from one side to the other as we're going through this motion. What you can be mindful of here is not allowing yourself to start from a compressed position. So maybe start to build that pressure and that base of pressure that we were working on in the previous 2 exercises, and see if you can sustain some of that as you're starting to incorporate this rotational pattern around it. This will allow some space and length to come into some areas that you likely have tightness in, as well as begin to reprogram and reorient this weight distribution factor, this hip rotation factor. And we're not only focusing on one piece of trying to create length, but rather looking at the whole body as a system and how we can dynamically start to link that together. You can work through this anywhere between 12 to about 14 repetitions on either side, and just try to have some fluidity to it. I think the upper body is just kind of dynamically rotating on top of the hips, and let that weight transfer really lead the motion as you're going through it. In today's video, we discuss some of the potential reasons as to why a scoliosis may be present, as well as some of the ways in which you can approach that in exercise in a more asymmetrical way. However, when it comes to understanding breathing, there's more nuance to it than just breathing in as hard as you can. So if you want to learn more of the nuance of how to access your breath in a more full way and tap into these small muscles that exist right in between your ribs called your intercostal muscles, then you can go check out a video I did on that right here.